Recently, a brief history of neoliberalism, the enigma of capital. Tonight, David will tell us something more about emancipatory potential that maybe this time of crisis brings us. And without further ado, I'll invite you just to greet Mr. David Harvey.
First to situate emancipatory possibilities against the background of the actual situation. One of the main arguments of the enigma of capital was that capital never solves its crisis problems, it simply moves them around. And it moves them around in a double sense, from one sector to another, as well as from one geographical location to another. And I want to talk about this briefly because I think it sets the stage for emancipatory possibilities. The crisis really became visible and obvious on September 15th, 2008, when Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. And the whole of the world's financial system froze. And it was clear at that point that the crisis was primarily located in the financial system. What then followed were a whole series of panic measures to try to save the financial system, and by patching here and innovating there, within 6 months or 9 months, effectively the financial system had been saved. And from that point on, as far as capital was concerned, the crisis was over. Which is very distressing for we Marxists who love a crisis. In other words, the object of our study had disappeared in a funny kind of way. But of course, it had been really relocated, and the crisis was relocated, as became obvious to everybody, in the sovereign debt of states. The states had bailed out the banks, and now the problem was the financial crisis within the state apparatuses. And that aspect of the crisis is still with us. But that form of crisis involved something else. When it was a purely financial crisis, if you can call it that, then the answer had to be written out in very strong economic terms. By moving into the state apparatus, the crisis became political. And there are certain political forces who actually are very strongly in accord with Marxists. They don't want the crisis to go away. There's a saying, you never let a good crisis go to waste. And there's an even more obvious saying, which I'll get back to, of Andrew Mellon, the famous banker who became Secretary of Treasury in the United States in the 1920s, who said this. He said that in a crisis, assets return to their rightful owners, i.e. him. And actually, what we're seeing is the crisis being prolonged so that in many ways it can return all of the assets to their, quote, rightful owners, which are, of course, the top of the capitalist class. But when I say the crisis moves around, I think it's useful also to reflect on where the crisis came from in the first instance, before the financial crisis. The crisis that we never really noticed, and we still don't analyze very carefully. The crisis arose in the property markets. And it therefore had within it a very strong component of urbanization, and in many respects I would want to say that the crisis arose as a crisis of urbanization, a crisis which was obvious to those of us who were looking very closely at the dynamics of urbanization, but which was not obvious to most other people. And in rising in property markets, I want to draw your attention to a political pattern which has gone on historically. Very recently, there have been some very important studies of what happened in the 1920s before the stock market crash of 1929. And studies in the United States show that speculation in property markets and the property market crash that occurred about a year before the crash of 1929, that this played a very important material precursor role to the main crisis. A precursor role which the analysts now suggest has been ignored at our peril. It is also the fact that the crisis of 1973, which many people attribute to the oil price rise, began at least 6 months before in global property markets. It is the case that the Japanese expansion, when everybody thought Japan was hegemonic and dominant, at the end of the 1980s, the crash in Japan was located in the land market. There was, around the same time, a huge crash in savings and loan, which centered a major financial set of difficulties in 1987. In 1992, the Swedish banks had to be nationalized because of excessive speculation in property markets. The crash that occurred in Southeast Asia in 1997-98 had a very strong component of speculative activity, particularly in Thailand, around property markets. So there is a long history of intertwining of crisis formation and property market speculation and urban dynamics. And in the same way there has been a long history of that, there's been another history which parallels it, unsurprisingly, which is that the solutions to crisis are often spelled out in urban terms. The most obvious example was in the United States after 1945, in which suburbanization became a very convenient way to launch a dynamic transformation of the American economy that underpinned what are now called the golden years of capitalism in the 1950s and 1960s, of strong growth. And that strong growth was based on suburbanization. That strong growth was based in not only an economic project, but also a political project. Because it was well understood that those people who had fought in the Second World War did not return to the United States with the idea that they were going to live under conditions of the Great Depression of the 1930s. And they were politically determined that that should not be the case. So one of the ways in which the US solved both its political problem and its economic problem was to suburbanize, because suburbanization involved turning at least a significant sector of the working class into property-owning homeowners who were mortgage indebted. And as they said back in the 1930s, when they reformed the mortgage laws to make it mortgage accessible to that group in the population, debt-encumbered homeowners don't go on strike. And I think the political consequence was that you turned a central city, urbanized working class of renters into a very conservative property-owning class living in the suburbs. But of course, all of that was bought at a price. It depended upon dirt cheap oil. It depended upon a profligate use of land. It depended upon paying no mind to the environmental consequences of air pollution and eventually global warming. So that solution to the crisis of the 1930s, which was the suburbanization of the 1950s and 1960s, was a very important solution, but you can see immediately that it had certain contradictory consequences. So connect urbanization and capital accumulation and those two histories and put them together. This brings me, if you like, to the geographical movement. The crash in the property market was highly located. It was located in the southwest of the United States, Southern California, Arizona, Nevada, also in Florida and Georgia, and some other places. There were some parallel speculative bubbles in other parts of the world, most notably in the Spanish property market and the Irish property market, and there were other places where some of this was going on. But none of this was going on in Canada. None of this was going on in Germany. So a global crash had a very regional, local origin in property speculative development in these very specific parts of the world. And I think it's important to understand it, and important to understand why it was that that became so significant within the financial system. Mortgage debt in the United States, and in fact most of the advanced capitalist countries, accounts for about 40% of gross domestic product. It is huge and hugely important, and we forget the significance of that at our peril. And part of what I want to do here is to argue that in the same way that urbanization has this very significant role in the history of both capital accumulation and capitalist crisis formation, so we have to look at the urban as a site of emancipatory struggles and of emancipatory politics. And that unless we're prepared to do that, many things will go on around us which we'll be totally unaware of and therefore unable to work with in a creative political way. Now, that geography, that initial geography, went global through the financial system, centrally, of course, in New York and London. And as it went global, it had all kinds of ramifications. It had ramifications for anybody who had invested in all of those strange financial instruments, collateralized debt obligations. And in fact, many European banks had invested in it. The Icelandic banks were heavily involved in peddling it. So anybody who was part of that got caught. And so there were serious problems around the world, ramifications. And so you had to have bailouts of banks in various parts of the world because they had become heavily involved in that speculative activity. But again, certain banking systems did not get involved. That of India did not get involved. That of Canada did not get involved. So therefore, there was no crisis in the financial system in Canada. But at the same time as the crisis hit in the United States, so suddenly consumption dropped. And what that then led to was a real hit on export producers. So when you went to East Asia and Southeast Asia, main export economies, suddenly they were faced with mass unemployment. 20 million jobs were lost in China. Almost like that. Same was true in Taiwan and in South Korea and right throughout East and Southeast Asia. The export markets crashed. So this was, if you like, the geographical spread. So that China suffered simply because of what happened in California. That is what globalization, of course, is really about. How things spread around. But as I've suggested, there was an immediate global response to this. And it wasn't only in the United States, it was also all of the world's central bankers, the sudden formation of this new configuration, the G20, which met over the question of restoring financial stability. And initially there was agreement in the G20. And the agreement was, we have to stabilize the financial system at all costs. And they did, as I've suggested, at the expense of creating the sovereign debt crisis. But at this point, the G20 splits largely along political lines. Because I've suggested the sovereign debt crisis poses political problems. What do you do when you have debt? What is the proper response to it? Now, I can go into all kinds of intricacies, but basically what I would suggest is that the world has divided into two camps right now. The first camp is centered on China. And the Chinese response, whether it was consciously put out this way or not, was to engage in what we would call a straight Keynesian program of stimulus response to the crisis. That is, the Chinese government immediately released something like $600 billion into infrastructural investment projects. This was almost as large as the US stimulus package, but also highly targeted towards infrastructures. The US passed a stimulus package, but most of it went to tax cuts, which don't do anything. The Chinese put it into building things, making things, roads, high-speed rail networks, irrigation projects, building whole new cities, building new physical infrastructures and production capacities. And this was all debt financed. But of course the Chinese had the surpluses to do it. Them going further into debt meant nothing because they had huge foreign exchange reserves. And the 20 million people who lost their jobs either returned to the export industries as they slowly recovered, or moved into infrastructural employment, or in some instances stayed back in their rural areas. So here you have a situation in which the Chinese respond by a stimulus package, debt financed, and very quickly China, which suddenly saw its growth rate go down from 10% to around 6%, suddenly finds its growth rate back up around 10% in 2009. And when the International Labour Organization did a survey to find out what the net job losses were in the world, in China the net job losses turned out to be something like 3 million out of the 20 million initial. So in other words, they recovered really very fast. And as they recovered, they of course created new demand, particularly for raw materials. So any country that was supplying China with raw materials suddenly found itself doing very well. Australia hardly experienced this whole crisis that we went through. A brief dip, and then the Chinese demand picked up, and as a prime supplier of raw materials to China, Australia is booming. Chile, which supplies copper, was soon booming. Much of Latin America, which reoriented its trade to China, 20% or tenfold increase in trade from Latin America to China. Mainly, of course, in Latin America, agricultural products. So most of Latin America has become one vast soybean plantation, mainly producing for the China market, with all kinds of environmental and other consequences. But Latin America has been booming, 7 or 8% growth rates in Argentina and Brazil, 7% growth rates in Australia. So there you have a response to the crisis, which is about absorbing labour. And it's about absorbing labour in part because in the China case, the absorption of labour is a clear political necessity. If China does not absorb its labour, it probably faces massive unrest. So here you have a political response along Keynesian lines, which is actually reviving growth in a certain kind of way. The political response in the United States is politically divided between those people who really do want to try and get out of the crisis and those people who want to keep us in it. Put very crudely, the Republicans do not want Obama to go into a presidential election with a revived economy. And they will do anything they can to prevent an economic revival before that election. which means that the one weapon they wield is the only answer to the debt crisis, is not to grow out of it, as is happening in East Asia, but austerity. And the austerity is an occasion for a further attack upon the standard of living of the working people of the country. It's an opportunity to do the Andrew Mellon thing, which is to soak as much as you possibly can out for the elite of the elite. Now, this happens to fit with a very long history of what neoliberalization was all about from the very beginning. The crisis of the 1970s in the United States and Europe was seen as a crisis of capital accumulation, but it was also seen as a crisis of capitalist class power. They were threatened. They were threatened by well-organized unions. They were threatened by democratic parties. In Europe, they were threatened by communist parties threatening to come to power. And they went on the counterattack. And they went on counterattack big time. And what happened was that counterattack was built around two, I think, very important principles, which is what I want to talk about here. There are two kinds of costs that capital never wants to bear. These costs, if it can be organized, are treated, as the economists call it, as externalities, something which you shove aside and say, that's somebody else's responsibility, not mine. And those two fields of externality are of two sorts. The first is that capital does not want to bear any of the costs of environmental degradation which it causes. It externalizes them. Stick the pollutants into the environment, let somebody else bother about the effects. So you externalize all of those costs. In the origins of capitalism, you've seen all those pictures of, belching factories, smoke and pollutants and dirt and grime and all the rest of it. Environmental collapses going on the local kind of sort. Capital didn't want to have anything to do with that. The second arena of costs that capital wants absolutely nothing to do with are the costs of social reproduction. By which I mean the costs which are born in the household of caring for the sick or the elderly or kids, or their education, their health care, all of those kinds of things. We don't want to care for those. And in Marx's Capital, he puts it this way. The capitalist gives the worker a wage as low as possible, and then basically says to the worker, you figure out how to reproduce yourself and reproduce your social life on that wage, and don't bother me about how you're going to take care of grandma or how you're going to take care of the kids. That's your business. This is externalizing the costs of social reproduction and externalizing the costs of the social reproduction of the labor force. Now, 200 years of struggle did two things. It forced capital increasingly to take account of those costs and to internalize some of them, so that its ability to just pour dirty water into people's wells and all the rest of it steadily got attacked. And in the United States, for example, at the end of the 1960s, we saw the formation and the creation of institutions like the Environmental Protection Agency, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which were forcing capital to internalize some of those costs that they did not want to bear. The same thing happened with the costs of social reproduction, which were increasingly forced upon capital either by trade union agreements so that workers got health care and pension rights in their contracts, or through the formation of the social welfare state. And by the time you get into the 1970s, therefore, in the advanced capitalist world, many of those costs were being pushed further and further upon capital. And capital revolted. And since then, they've been trying to externalize those costs. That's what neoliberalization was about. And one of the ways in which, of course, you could do it was simply to take the jobs to some place where you would not be forced to internalize any of those costs. China, a great place to go. And what you have in China is a sort of, what Arrighi calls partial proletarianization. The social costs of reproduction are born in the countryside. The immigrants go to the city. If they get sick, then they go back to the countryside and they get taken care of there. And what we're seeing is a parallel in the United States with illegal immigrants. Illegal immigrants are a very, very important labor force in the United States. But if they get sick, they can't be taken care of in the US system. They end up going back to Ecuador or to Peru or to Mexico or wherever. So if they get poisoned in the agribusiness fields of California through too much exposure to pesticide, they go back to die in the village in Mexico. So this is, if you like, one way of externalizing, but the other was to have a political attack upon all of those instruments by which capital is being forced to internalize. And this was what Ronald Reagan, in particular, promised. He promised capital, we're going to stop all of that. And one of the ways they stopped it, since they couldn't politically get rid of the Environmental Protection Agency, they would find the biggest idiot on the universe and put them in charge of it. And Republicans do this all the time. They always say government is incompetent, but it's incompetent because they deliberately put totally incompetent people in charge of the Environmental Protection Agency. And as we saw in New Orleans and Katrina, that you had an idiot in charge of the emergency services who didn't know what to do, and a lot of the tragedy flowed from that. So this is one of the strategies. The other strategy is to defund it. Yeah, the agency still exists, but it has no funds to do anything. So there has been a political attack on the environmental question, so that increasingly capital can externalize all of those costs. The same happened with all of things like pension rights, healthcare rights, all of those kinds of things. But there was a very neat way to do it. And this is what Reagan did. What Reagan did was, when he came in to power, the top tax rate in the United States was something like 72%. In 1945, it was 92%, which said that the top capitalists only got 8 cents of every dollar they earned. Now, we are told that high tax rates of that kind inhibit growth, but those were the tax rates that worked between 1945 and 1972. What Reagan did was to reduce the top tax rate from 72% to 32%. And of course, that created all sorts of budgetary difficulties. The second thing he did was to fight a great arms race with the Soviet Union, saying that actually they were going to bring the Soviet Union to its knees through an arms race. Actually, what they managed to do was to commit suicide in the United States by the arms race, but they didn't care about that. Those two things drove the United States hugely into debt. And by the middle of the last administration of Reagan, his budget director confessed something. I don't think he got very popular for doing it, but he said our plan was to so run up the debt that we then had an excuse to go after all of the social and environmental programs we don't like and don't want. It was a deliberate strategy of increasing the debt to the point where austerity became necessary because you are destroying the lives of future generations. How can we deal with that? Well, we don't cut the defense budget. We don't do this. No, we go after all of these social programs. Now, there's an interesting parallel here. What did Bush Jr. do? He cut the tax rate for the rich from around 39% to 33%. He gave them an extra thing because most of them earn money on capital gains, so he reduced the capital gains tax to 15%. So the effective tax rate in the United States on the very rich is somewhere around 15 to 17%. Now it's interesting. We are told that low tax rates stimulate growth. Go look at the growth figures, it doesn't work out. So, but Bush did that. He fought 2 unfunded wars, Afghanistan and Iraq, costing around $1 trillion. He ran up the debt, and all of the time, his vice president, Dick Cheney, when anybody raised a question, saying, well, what about the debt? Cheney always responded, Reagan taught us that deficits do not matter. The debt doesn't matter. Well, what are the Republican Party saying now? The debt, austerity, let's get rid of all of those programs we don't like. Can't touch defense. Can't touch certain things that are very special for them. So my point here is there's been a political strategy from the 1970s onwards which has been purely about externalizing the costs of environmental degradation and of social reproduction. The Republican Party in the United States wants to go after health care. They've already privatized the educational system. They want to go after state pensions. They want to go after all of that. Now, this political philosophy is not confined to the United States. What is the Cameron government doing in Britain? It's using the debt to go after all of those programs. What is going on throughout most of Europe is austerity. It's absolutely essential. But austerity for whom? And austerity about what? Austerity in the realm of social reproduction. Austerity in the realm of environmental regulation. Now this, it seems to me, is the situation. And it's one that's also paralleled by that other aspect of what neoliberalization has always been about, which is that ever since the middle of the 1970s, a rule has emerged, which is that if the financial system gets into difficulties, we bail it out at all costs. This actually was what they did to Mexico back in 1982. The Mexicans had been persuaded to borrow a lot of Gulf oil money via the New York investment banks, and then the interest rate went up and all kinds of other ugly things happened and they couldn't pay. They were going to go bankrupt. They were going to default. But what the US understood very profoundly was if they defaulted, the New York investment banks would be destroyed. Desperate to save the New York investment banks, the US Treasury and the International Monetary Fund went to Mexico and said basically, we'll bail you out so you can pay back the New York bankers. And you have to be bailed out because if you don't, if you default, nobody will ever invest in your part of the world again. And the Mexicans fell for it, so they agreed that's what they would do. But in order to do that, they had to reduce the standard of living of an already poor population by 25%. What we're looking at in the United States right now and what's been happening in Britain is the threat of a 25% reduction in living standards in order to bail out the banking system. And this, of course, is what is being visited upon all of those European countries, Ireland, Portugal, of course Greece, Spain, reductions in living standards, and abandonment of the whole field of social reproduction. Now, what does this tell us about the politics of our time? What does it tell us about what the left should be organising about? I think one of the major things to say is that the left should have a very coherent project saying capital should bear all of the costs that it visits upon the world in terms of environmental degradation. It should internalise all of them. And it should internalise all of the costs of social reproduction. We are not going to go back to that world that Marx described, where we give you the lowest possible wage and then wait for you to figure out how to live and how to reproduce on that. It seems to me this, therefore, is a very simple unitary project. That is where the left should be. And it is a project which actually connects to some of my first part of my argument. Because a lot of this project is also about the reorganisation of urban life, the reconfiguration of urban modes of living. But here you find the left often has certain historical presuppositions which frankly don't work anymore. People like to talk about production, but the imaginary of production is the factory worker. My imaginary of production are all of those people who produce the city, who produce urbanisation, the construction industry, the people who actually fix the sewers, the plumbers. And actually a vast amount of value and surplus value is produced through urbanisation. And capital uses that. And you can see it in almost every city you go to. Developers are actually reshaping the city along lines that have nothing necessarily to do with the well-being of the population, but have everything to do with the dynamics of capital accumulation. If I'm correct on that, and I can go in much greater detail, if I'm correct about that, this says that the city is a field of class struggle and should always be considered a primary field for class struggle. The struggle over whose city is it? How is it going to function? How is it going to be organised? But the left hasn't really thought about the problem of how do you organise a whole city? But there's tremendous power latent within that system. In the United States, we now have people who are organising back around the food chain coming into the major cities, into New York City, from the fields and the farms, right the way through the food chain. Interestingly, almost all of the workers in that food chain are immigrant workers, quite a lot of them illegal, for reasons I've already mentioned. Organise that food chain and imagine cutting that food chain into New York City around certain political demands. Imagine what tremendous power there is. You could stop the city. And as we learned to our cost in some ways, but also as a political lesson of great importance, after 9/11, New York City stopped moving. And within 3 or 4 days, Mayor Giuliani was coming out and saying, for God's sake, get out your credit cards and start shopping. Bush came on television in a TV ad and said, start flying again, start moving again. Because as Marx teaches us, capital is not a thing, it's about a flow of value. Cut the flow, and capital is fucking. And cut the flow. But in order to cut the flow, you've got to organise along the flow, not in places. You organise along the flow. And in order to do that, you have to imagine organising amongst the whole population that we don't normally think of, organising. We have new organisations emerging in the United States which are attempting to organise precarious labour. We have now a group called the Excluded Workers' Congress that is organising domestic workers, taxi drivers. One of the biggest employees of labour in the United States are the restaurants. It's very difficult to organise restaurant workers unless you have a different set of organising principles than a traditional labour movement. And immigrant workers, that's what I'm talking about. And as I mentioned this afternoon, one of the things that has finally happened is the organised labour came to the Excluded Workers' Congress and said, we need you. And we want to sign an agreement with you in terms of collaborative activities. There is tremendous power, provided we change our sights. And at the same time as we change our sights, you ask certain questions. How is daily life reproduced in the city? Who is doing it and what are its qualities? This is where it seems to me it's possible to create an emancipatory project around the idea of recreating an urban dynamic in a completely different image than that which is given by capital accumulation. In other words, in the language of the right to the city, there is the right to the city which is exercised by developers and financiers, and then there's a right to the city which can be exercised by the people. And what would that right to the city look like? This, I think, is a very, very important way to start to rethink politics for the 21st century. And some of these organisations, historically, have been very, very powerful. For example, back in the 1970s, there was something called a Green Band movement. The construction workers of New South Wales and Australia got together and said, basically, we refuse to build any project which is environmentally unsound. And they stopped a whole bunch of environmentally unsound projects. It's not hard to imagine being able to do that. Emancipatory politics has to rest on a certain source of power. And we have to look at where the points of intervention are and what those points of intervention are about. I'm very excited about these sorts of projects. It's a very exciting set of possibilities. And there's a lot of organising already going on in many parts of the world around these sorts of questions. And so the unification that can come out from taking where we're at and then moving us back from the qualities of daily life in the city and the qualities of daily reproduction and environmental issues and all the rest of it, moving back in the other direction and saying, well, what kind of financial institutions do we really need? Organising a whole city is not going to be easy. A lot of the alternative forms of organising that are out there right now, unfortunately, don't spread into that area. There is, on the left, what I call a fetishism of organisational form around, in which certain preferred organisational forms are irrespective of whether they have any capacity whatsoever to change the world in any major way. So there's a great concern, nothing should be hierarchical. Well, be my guest and try and organise a whole city without being hierarchical. Sorry, you won't do it. You might do it in a rural commune somewhere, great, I'd like that too. But when you're talking about a whole city, you're talking about something radically different. The question then is how to organise hierarchical structures that can also be democratically controlled and popularly controlled. That is then the issue. So there are many questions on the left of organisational form which are being experimented with, and we need to actually start to theorise about them and think about them as the form of a political project. That is, maybe what we should be thinking about is the emancipatory city. And it has a long history. Most utopian projects are urban in their own way, or a lot of them are. And it's possible to actually set up a kind of dialectical way of thinking about these progressive transformations. And that is, if you like, where much of the hope that I would have for the future would be about. But in order to do that, we need, as it were, to reposition ourselves, reimagine what a left politics is about and what it's for. Reorient it towards the production and reproduction of a daily life which is much more adequate than the one we now have. Revolt against capital over these questions of its externalization of all of those costs. Because I can tell you something, almost certainly if capital is forced to bear all of the costs of what it does, it will go bankrupt. It will go under. And this is a nice, smooth way, instead of going on barricades, of actually destroying their power. A nice, smooth way. Of course, what they're going to do is to call up the ghost of Ronald Reagan and all the rest of it and say, okay, we're going to really fight you on that. But it is a political fight. And right now, this mantra of austerity is doing huge damage to the world, huge damage throughout much of Europe and through much of the United States. The other problem is that the Chinese response is also doing huge damage. In fact, this brings me, if you like, to my concluding argument. One of the big theses in the enigma of capital is that 3% compound growth forever, which is the minimum requirement of a dynamic capitalist system, is an impossibility. And that for the last 30 years we've been running into blockages to that. We can't take comfort, and the capitalists should not take comfort from the fact that China is growing very fast. Because when you look at the environmental costs, when you look at the social reproduction costs, in the Chinese version, they're no good either. So in fact, we have a global project here, which is about the transformation of accumulation for accumulation's sake and production for production's sake, as Marx put it, into a question of social reproduction for emancipation's sake. And that seems to me to be the slogan the left should be thinking about right now. So let me leave it there. Thanks very much.